everyone. Thank you for coming out. I hope you'll enjoy our presentation this morning. A brief introduction, and I'll turn the microphone over to Annie. Annie Kidder is a denizen of the theater who has transformed into an advocate for children and our public schools. We in public education are lucky to have her working with us. An independent citizen voice for students, Ms. Kidder found her new vocation while, as a parent, observing the time and energy Ontario parents were investing in fundraising that she thought was the role of our system of public taxation. Annie keenly appreciated the dangers of this approach, the two-tier system it invites, and the diminishment of students from less affluent neighborhoods and homes. Public schools are meant to be protected from these markers of wealth inequality. Since 1996, People for Education has grown to be a movement of over 15,000 persons that raises a budget of $1 million per year. It provides research evidence for Canadians on various educational issues, including the impact of class size and composition, the need for specialized support staff, the gross lack of services for our special needs students, and the right way to evaluate the quality of our schools. Ms. Kidder, unlike so many non-educators who position themselves as experts on education, has worked toward humane and valid evaluation rather than supporting the hollow standardized test mania that has been with us in North America since the 1980s. People for Education has been a counterweight to the politically motivated and scientifically irresponsible Fraser Institute rankings and reports. Annie Kidder, her staff, and other partners provide a model of activist citizens fighting for the rights of the less fortunate and advocating for the dream of democracy that is our birthright. It is my great pleasure to present Annie Kidder to speak with you today in the hope that her spirit of renewal touches you as you assume your vital political roles in our great province, British Columbia.
I think it's amazing and wonderful that you have this thing, the Columbia Institute, which as far as I know, there isn't anything like it in Ontario, where you're already connecting the dots, which is what I'm supposed to be talking about today. You're already working across systems, across sectors to talk about the health and strength of your communities and your province. So you've already succeeded. We can all just go to the bar now. Well, maybe it's too early in the morning to go to the bar. So this is going to take, two sides of my brain. So did the slide change? Like I can't even see them. Okay, so People for Education is an Ontario organization. We've been around for more than 22 years. And we started in Ontario at a time of a lot of strife in education, a lot of fighting, a lot of polarization. You were on one side or the other. Everybody hated each other. There were lots of job actions. And we felt, perhaps naively, there needed to be a voice for the system itself. And so we are an organization that's non-aligned, we're non-partisan, we are independent of the system, but we operate out of a belief that public education is incredibly important to all of us. And the kind of fundamental part of that, as Paul said, has to do with equity, or the importance of equity in education, because part of that ideal of public education is that it provides every child, no matter what kind of families they come from, or their immigration status, or their economic status, or what language they speak, their race, their ethnicity, their religion, their learning needs. It's supposed to provide every single child with an equitable chance for success. So that's kind of where we begin. So that's basically who we are. We do a lot of different kinds of work, but we in particular base our work on evidence. We think it's incredibly important that we have facts to back up what we're talking about. And the other thing that's important to us is that we truly believe that public education is connected to everything else. All the things that you're talking about here, all of your concerns, whether they be housing, the climate, poverty, childcare, the health and strength of your communities, it's all connected to public education. So when we think about those connected dots, no matter which area we look at, and if we're looking even towards the future and thinking the changing nature, people talk about the skills revolution or the new knowledge economy, when we think about health and the impact public education has or somebody's education has on their likelihood to use the healthcare system, they're all connected. And for us, it's about sort of going upstream as far as you can in order to work on that thing that will have an impact on all of these other areas. And the reason, one of the reasons that we need to all be doing this and thinking about this together is that the world is kind of a mess, in my humble or not very humble opinion. We are dealing with so many different issues right now in the world and in polarization is one of them. I don't know if any of you were watching Poor England yesterday on television, but I was talking to my daughter on the phone, and she said, I can't believe people can say things like that out loud on television, that amount of hate, that they're not ashamed to actually share how they're feeling. Or we look at what happened in New Zealand, and we look at that sense of the division among us, the kind of suspicion and even hatred of the other. And that is growing it's growing in Canada, and it's growing across the world. We have gaps, economic gaps, social gaps, educational gaps that we are not changing. And we actually have this social mobility now, even in Canada, wonderful, good, nice Canada, is actually diminished. So in the olden days, I am very old, there used to be an assumption that you were going to do better than your parents. That assumption is no longer true. And for young people, they really feel the pressure of that part is not true. And that's a kind of horrifying reality. We have the disaster with our environment. When watching Mozambique last week and listening, the former First Lady said that Beira, I think is the name of the city, is the first example of a city destroyed by climate change. So we seem to, again, be collectively incapable of really, truly doing anything about this. We also have an erosion in our kind of trust of systems. Now, if you've been watching the federal government, you can kind of understand why people are getting a little bit cynical about politics, politicians, and government and how it works. But it's worrying that cynicism is sort of flowing down into everything. And that erosion of public trust then actually erodes the idea that there is a public good or that there is a common good, something that helps all of us. One of the scariest things for me is this idea that we live in a post-truth era, as if fact and fiction were interchangeable, as if, my opinion is good enough and I don't need any evidence at all. I was at a conference yesterday, I was telling people I listened to a woman on the radio, and it was some kind of phone-in show. She was very upset. The host said, but the Canadian Pediatric Society said the evidence is this. And she said, I don't care what the evidence says, I don't agree. And the idea that evidence was something that you could not agree with, and that was very firm in her mind. It was like, yeah, whatever. It's a new idea to me, anyway. And we think of Canada kind of as better than that, but Leger did a poll of Canadians, and one of the questions was this, was to find out whether or not they thought science was a matter of opinion. And 43% of them said yes. So that's one of the reasons you can see then the problem in terms of climate change. If we think science is a matter of opinion, how are we actually going to make the kind of structural changes we need to make? If people go, whatever, yeah, I know those guys said that, you can look at it in a lot of other things, vaccinations being one of them. We also know, just in terms of the kind of where we are right now in the world, about a fifth of us struggle in some way with our mental health. That's even more true among young people. It's a kind of constant problem that also we seem not to collectively have been able to do anything about. We all know that there are the very, very rich and the rest of us. It is extraordinary how big that division is and how much it is also not changing. In fact, it's only changing the bad way. And we do work in Ontario, so these are the graduation rates in provincially funded schools in Ontario school boards, and you can see the difference between 87% of students in Ontario graduate after 5 years, but only 60% of First Nation students who are in publicly funded schools in Ontario school boards graduate. So we have these big divisions. this is where I'm challenging myself, because then I have to remember what comes next. So then the big question becomes, how do we have hope? And I'm here to say, I think there is hope. You could list a million other reasons for what's wrong with the world or for the huge kind of challenges we're facing, but I think that there is hope, and I think that part of that hope lies in public education. But I am not saying that the hope lies in our children, that the children are our hope, as if we can just kind of turn it all over to them and hope they do a better job than we did. I have a 26-year-old. I have two kids. One's 31, one's 26. My 26-year-old is studying public policy, and she loves to tell me how my generation ruined everything, and thank you very much, and now you're leaving us with your mess. So we can't just sit around and go, sorry, I'm retiring, so can you clean this up? We have to think about what the things are that we can do now, all of us, and I'm older than a lot of you, but working in systems, in various systems, so in municipalities, in school boards, in provincial government, in federal government, in community organizations. What are the kinds of things that we need to do to the structures, to policy, to how we work across systems that are going to build back that sense of hope? And it does start with going, these are the big things we're addressing, and sort of connecting the dots among them. And for me right now, this young girl is what I hold in my heart. And I hold her in my heart because she's amazing, for one thing. I don't know if you've seen her speak, but I think she's 13 now, maybe she's 14. But to her, the house is on fire. So it's, for her, there's not, and I love her, it's like, I don't want your namby-pamby hope. I want you to do something about this now. And I think that we all need to remember that. Her speech at the World Economic Forum is really angry. It's not like, thank you so much for having me and for listening to young people. It's still not going to swear, but it's kind of F you guys. You're not doing what you have to do. And there's a huge and urgent problem. And I've been talking to a lot of young people lately, oddly, going to plays and actually seeing young people, and really been struck by their lack of a sense of hope. And they're feeling, among 20-year-olds and younger, that the world, they're feeling that humanity is on the brink of ending, mostly because of climate change. But we can take this statement about the house being on fire and apply it to any of those things I listed before: the gap between rich and poor, the inevitability of your socioeconomic status in terms of how it applies to where you're going to end up, the problems that we have with government, the idea of post-truth, all of those things. We need to think of this as the house is on fire. And I'm not telling you this because you don't already know and you're not already doing this work, and I'm not here to kind of lecture you. But I think that as the adults, we have to live with that sense of urgency. And one of my favorite quotes in the last while is from Murray Sinclair, who said, education got us into this mess and education will get us out of it. And if we think of even of the calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, a lot of them have to do with education, but a lot of them have to do with education and across and through other systems. So again, it's being able to see this as a kind of interconnected system. So for us, one of the ways we can look at this, and really I'm here as an advocate for public education to really say this needs to be everybody's issue. When you're thinking of the things that you're working on in your various systems, I want you to think about the public education aspect of it too. From an economic point of view, even there, we can talk about return on investment if you want. But there's the return on there's an economic return and a social return. And everybody agrees about this. Even like the OECD is not some kind of lefty organization over there in Switzerland. They are, about business, they're about economic cooperation and development. And they are clear that about the benefits of education. And they actually have done lots of reports on the benefits of public education as well. And that there's no more, private schools aren't better, public education overall does the job. So for them, we have to think of it this way. There's a fabulous economist, Nobel laureate James Heckman, who's done amazing work and has a beautiful website that you should all go and look at, especially if you're concerned about early childhood education, childcare, economy, all of those things. This is an economist, and for him, investing in children is the thing we need to do, and it is the thing that will make a difference overall. And he's very clear that the return is at least 10%. On the money you put in, you get 10%. We had a chair of our board, our first chair of our board, who actually had been the chair of the Toronto School Board. And she at some point said, the problem with children is they take an unconscionably long time to grow up. And her point was that you couldn't see the impact for 20 years. And so if you're a government, you like that 4-year turnover. It's like, we said we were going to do this, and 3 years later, ta-da, we did it, we can see it. So the economic investment is harder to see because it's obviously in savings in all those other areas, and also having people that can actually run our world. But we need to remember that and remind ourselves of that in terms of that connection. When we in People for Education think about equity, again, back to the part of our kind of fundamental approach to education, we've been looking at it for a long time, and everybody thinks about, or assumes that public education should be able to kind of overcome intergenerational cycles of poverty. We should be able to move that equity needle that says that just your socioeconomic status doesn't predestine you to a certain kind of level of success in education. But that equity needle actually hasn't moved really for years. It still is the biggest driver, your socioeconomic status. So to us, we think the problem is that we have the wrong needle altogether. And this is where I think BC is actually ahead. No, I shouldn't say actually. BC is ahead of Ontario, certainly, in this way, where it's been looking at what are the other things that we need to look at and focus on. But BC still measures the same stuff. And we think that part of the problem with the equity needle, if we only keep measuring reading, writing, and math, and I'll get to that more in a minute, we're never going to shift that needle. There was, part of this work comes from BC. So different groups of people have looked at kids, and they've looked at them when they're coming into school. So I'm 4 years old, I'm coming into school, and they look at their competencies and skills. So these are measured sometimes with the early development instrument, and they are the kinds of competencies that people call, unfortunately, soft skills or non-cognitive skills, which people who study neuroscience no longer divide things into cognitive and non-cognitive. It's all in your brain, actually, and there's no line in between. But they're looking at things like communication, collaboration, social skills, empathy, resilience, things like that. And in this study that people in British Columbia did do, who are working on the middle development instrument, they looked at kids who came in, a group of kids, I think 800, who came in to kindergarten, and then they looked at the same kids again in grade 4. To see, and with a kind of equatable instrument, to see whether or not any of those competencies and skills had changed they were in school for a long time. And lo and behold, none of them had changed. And for us, what this is a sign of, and hopefully this is changing in British Columbia, is that we're not focusing on those what are teachable, learnable skills and competencies. They're not, character attributes that you're born with, or if you're lucky to come from privilege that your family can buy for you. They're actually things that need to be part of the education system itself, because other people have done studies of kids going up to 22 and going, whoa, actually, those competencies are more predictive of educational outcomes than anything else. So despite test scores, despite all those other things, if you don't have those competencies and skills that I'll talk about in a minute, you're less likely to be successful in education, and if you're less likely to be successful, it's going to have an impact on all those other things, your health, your civic engagement, etc. So for us, then, it came down to what do we need to do and how do we need to think about this? So one of the things we did was we went, who invented that idea, the 3 R's anyway? We have a research director, she did this, not me. And she went back to find out who coined that term. And it was this old white guy in 1790. So we still operate, we still measure our systems based on those 3 R's from 1790. And it's 2019. And I think we all agree everybody needs a lot more than the 3 R's in order to be successful, happy, thriving human beings. So that was kind of the first kind of twig for us that we really needed to do something about this. And this is important because we still in British Columbia, despite changing the curriculum and having core competencies, still when we measure the success of the system, we measure reading, writing, and math. And it's partly out of a public desire for that kind of simple proxy measure of success. We like the up good, down bad graph. Things going down, very bad. Things going up, very, very good. We had somebody, a former minister, federal minister, declare it a national emergency in Canada because our math scores went down by 2 points in PISA. It's not a national emergency, but it made education systems change what they were doing. It's like, oh, we better fix this right now. But we have to remember that guy, 1790. So for us, it's about the new basics. And again, British Columbia already far ahead, and much farther ahead now, I would say, not to be political, than Ontario. So for us, the new basics involve students having a range of capacities, and you guys know this stuff because you live here, but they need to be able to collaborate. They need to be able to keep on learning. They need to be able to take things they've learned in one area and apply them to another. It's no use teaching kids the skills they need for jobs that exist right now because all the jobs are going to change. They need to be able to take critical feedback and listen to it and go back in and try it again. There is an incredible video of a school in Ashcroft, I wish I had the link here, that you should all go look at, where they are doing amazing work in this area. And the kids in those schools, when you ask them what they're learning, as the principal says, and then you see it, she says they don't tell you they're learning about the War of 1812, which then they don't. They talk about, when they're asked what they learned, they talk about, well, I learned to make a presentation, or I learned that my first idea really didn't work at all and I had to kind of throw it away and look at it again. Or I learned that in my group, if I listened to other people, then I could change this. So what they were learning was the skills you need for your life. No matter what your job is or what you're going to do or where you are in your life, they were learning that. So we have to make sure that our kids are learning those things, that they understand who they are, how they feel about themselves. And these are things they need to start learning when they're 4, if not earlier. And it's always been one of my kind of frustrations with the education system is that we do all this stuff in early childhood and then it's like, now you're 6, we don't care about that stuff anymore. Now we're going to get down to the serious stuff, the 3 R's from that old white guy. And the reason that our kids need that is because Canada needs it. So again, back to our view of what kind of world do we want to live in, what kind of country, what kind of community, which is People for Education's approach to this. We have to think about what do we need from our next generations, and then think about what we need to be doing in our schools. So you're all working in different areas and understanding needs in your communities and outside of that. And you need people like this. We all need people like this. So there's a huge kind of social responsibility to make sure that our education systems are doing this and are understanding their place in our world, their sort of connection to our social response, what kind of world we want to live in. And for us, part of it starts with this idea of a kind of nestedness. So there are academics who talk about what a quality learning environment is, and they talk about it as nested. And this part, it's fine and important, but it's actually that nest keeps on going and going and going. So education, frustratingly, education systems, I think, are for the most part not very good at talking to other systems. There's a kind of, even schools, you kind of open the door, the kids go in, the door gets closed, and You don't know what goes on in there. And there's a sense, I go to education conferences all the time, and they kind of talk to themselves a lot. And they feel terribly proud and sit around going, we know this and we know that. But they don't see it as part of their responsibility to talk to the rest of the world. And maybe British Columbia works way better than Ontario. But in Ontario, we have absolute total silos in terms of levels of government up and down and government on a horizontal level. So it's really hard, for instance, to get school boards and municipalities to plan together because there's not an overall structure that says you must plan together, and it's not supported. Now, there are great examples of boards and municipalities doing that, but they're sometimes doing it despite the system rather than as an assumed part of the system. And if we go back to all those connected dots and think about health, think about social services, think about the criminal justice system, think about strong communities, think about climate, think about housing, transit, they are all connected and they should be connected to public education. So at People for Education, one of the things that we have been doing is we run an annual Ontario school survey that goes to all the schools in the province and collects data, again, so that we can have evidence about the impact of policy and funding changes on our schools. And now a lot of that evidence, which I'm going to talk about later in the second thing I'm doing here, is connected now to outside kind of community things. So for us, this is really where we are. It's that I hope that we all start to think about that interconnectedness. We all start to think about the incredibly huge purpose of public education. This is one of my favorite quotes. Now, it's from Edgerton Ryerson, who did lots of appalling things to set up the system of residential schools. He was a man of his time, but he also was a huge part in creating public education in Canada. And I think this is an incredibly apt quote right now, that an ignorant population are liable to be the dupes of demagogues. And not to mention any names, but we can see some countries where there are public education systems falling apart, and they may be the dupes of demagogues. And for the olden days guys, these guys, and this is nearly 200 years ago, they understood the connection between public education and being able to be a citizen. Being able to, for them, it was about Canada was getting a responsible government, and how could people vote if they actually weren't educated. So back to the beginning, it's remembering that all of these things are connected. I hope that we can have more conversations across the country, because the other silos are provincial in terms of how we can or can't talk about public education. Provinces get very persnickety about that. So I hope that we're making more of those connections. And we're also starting to think about, people talk a lot about access and inclusion, but for us the question now is access to what? And how can we redefine collectively what kind of education system we need for the young people that are in it now, for our communities, for our province, for our country, for our future, and how can we clarify what those are? So we're actually working with people from across Canada to begin to build a right to education framework, not so that people can have more complaints and take things to the Human Rights Council and have fights with their school boards, but more so that we can define what it is we want people to have access to. How do we ensure that not just my kids, because I happen to have money, I mean, I don't have that much money, I promise you, but I happen to be privileged. How can we make sure that they're not more privileged than other kids in terms of their access to those kind of core competencies and skills that are going to serve them in their life? So for me, to end, I think we have to remember this. I think we have to take this into our hearts. I think it's our responsibility as adults to act as if the house is on fire, and that part of this work, to me, you're already doing. I think you're already amazing, because you're already talking across. And until we start to really function across all our systems, we're not actually going to put that fire out. So, thank you very much.